Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video, and today I'm going to be carrying on with my little mini-series on this channel of Walter Scott Prize reviews. So, for those of you who don't know, the Walter Scott Prize is a prize focused on historical fiction that runs in the UK every year, and I have been reading along with the long list. I will leave my video kind of introducing this and talking about the long list down below, and also my last video reviewing books from the long list in which I talked about The Western Wind, Washington Black and Warlight. The shortlist has now come out. There are still quite a few books from the long list I'm interested in reading that I haven't got to yet, and there's also one of the books I'm going to be talking about today was on the long list but was not shortlisted. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to first review the 3 books that I've read in the last week or so that were on the Walter Scott long list, and then after that I will have a quick chat about my thoughts on the shortlist and sort of what I would like to win so far and my reading plans for the rest of the Walter Scott Prize. So the winner is not announced until June, so I have some more time to do a bit more reading, but I've now read 6 out of 12 of the long list and 4 out of 6 of the shortlist, so I think I should be able to read the entire shortlist. I don't see why not, and I still think there's a couple more on the long list I'd like to get to as well. But anyway, let's get into the 3 books I want to review today. As with the last one of these videos, I'm going to go in order from my least favourite to my favourite. So let's start off with After the Party by Cressida Connolly. Now, I had quite mixed feelings about this book. It was one of those books where I loved the writing a lot and I loved the first half, and then the second half really fell flat for me because it didn't quite go in the direction that I was thinking it would go. So, to explain what this book is about, it is set in sort of 1938 and the few years afterwards, and it follows a woman called Phyllis who returns back to England after having been abroad for some years and ends up moving back to Sussex where 2 of her sisters live, Nina and Patricia, who are both very different people and who don't get on with one another, and who Phyllis kind of tries to bridge the gap between. She is in her 30s, she's married, she has 3 children, and through her sister Nina she ends up getting involved with a particular group of people. And there is a particular significant incident that happens at a party of one of her new friends, and we know from the beginning that Phyllis, looking back on her life in the 30s from the 1970s, was in prison at some point during her life, and we don't know what for. In order for me to explain why I didn't completely love this book, I have to tell you who the group of people are that she gets involved with, which you don't find out for a little bit of the way through. It's probably like a quarter of the way through, spoiler. So if you would like to go into this book more blind, then feel free to wait until I hold up a different book upon which I would have finished talking about this one. But I feel like I can't explain why I didn't love this book without talking about that, and I don't feel like it's that big a spoiler. Like, I worked it out pretty early on, so you are warned. The group that Phyllis gets involved with is the British Union, previously known as the British Union of Fascists, and she and her sisters, especially Nina, get involved with the Fascist Party in Britain in the late 1930s. And in some ways this book is fascinating. It looks at the fascist movement in Britain in the late 1930s, and it looks at it in quite interesting ways, specifically looking at the role of women and also looking at the way in which many people who joined this movement were very naive. And for Phyllis and a lot of the other women in the group, it's about not wanting another war because they are worried about their husbands and sons. It's about wanting peace with Germany, regardless of whatever Germany's policies may be and regardless of how much they perhaps don't like Hitler. With After the Party, like I said, I loved the writing. I thought it was beautifully written. I thought it was really, really interesting. Looked at some really interesting themes with really interesting characterization, but the first half I thought was fantastic, and then in the second half I didn't enjoy it as much, partly because I think the whole way through I was waiting for Phyllis in the future, looking back on her life, to have a moment of realisation of how awful this group was that she's a part of, and she never does, and that I really struggled with. And I'm not saying that I don't think that's necessarily believable for the character and for the time period and so on, but that kind of bothered me. And the other thing that bothered me, I think, is that the kind of dramatic incident that she focuses on that kind of happens halfway through the book at this party actually isn't that important or that interesting and isn't really talked about very much in the second half, and I kind of didn't really get where the focus was. One thing I will say though that I did really like is I like the fact that the title, After the Party, both refers to like after this particular party that Phyllis is at and also like after the fascist party, and I think that's a very clever title. But the book, I loved the first half, and then it really fell flat for me because, like I said, I was waiting for Phyllis to have this kind of moment of realisation, and that doesn't happen, and I think I wanted this to be a slightly different book. So yeah, I enjoyed the writing, but this isn't one that I loved. This has made the shortlist, interestingly, but this is not one of my favourites to win. And then we have The Long Take by Robin Robertson. This is a really interesting novel and one that I really, really enjoyed, and one that has made the shortlist, and I wouldn't be sad if this won. This is a novel told in verse, which is something I don't think I've ever never read before, and it is set shortly after the Second World War, kind of follows the 10-15 years after the Second World War. We follow a man called Walker, who is a Canadian man who fought in the Second World War, and after the Second World War he is so shaken and devastated by what he saw other people do and what he himself did that he can't bear to go back to Canada, he can't bear to go back home, he can't bear to go back to his family or to the woman he loved, and instead he goes to the States. He travels between lots of different cities and ends up writing for a newspaper as a journalist, mostly writing about the issues of homelessness facing many soldiers after the Second World War. This I really enjoyed and found really fascinating. It's, like I said, it's a novel in verse. It's like nothing I've ever read before. But I feel like if I listened to this on audiobook, depending on how the person read it, I'm not sure that I would have known that it was in verse, if you see what I mean. It's more just like a slightly experimentally structured and formatted novel. And actually, I was worried I would struggle to follow where it was going. I was worried it would be a bit like 200 pages of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. I don't know why I thought it would be that, but that was what I had in my head that it would be, and it's not. It's really easy to follow, and it's not just kind of ideas. There's a lot of fully fledged scenes. You know, it is a novel, it's just told in verse form. It looks really interestingly at post-traumatic stress disorder, and it looks really interestingly at how the Second World War ruined the lives of many people who just couldn't go back to ordinary life afterwards. And I think the way it looks at homelessness in the States, especially for soldiers in the 1940s and 50s, and the way that the war kind of prevented so many people from getting on with their lives and getting jobs, and just the issues that faced a lot of soldiers after the war is really fascinating. Like, this is thematically really interesting and not really an area or effect of the Second World War that I often hear spoken about. So I thought this was really brilliant. I really enjoyed it and would highly recommend it. And yeah, like I said, this made the shortlist. I wouldn't be too sad if it won. However, my favourite Walter Scott longlistee that I read recently, and in fact I think my favourite that I've read from the Walter Scott Prize longlist so far, which very sadly did not make the shortlist, is this. This is All the Lives We Never Lived by Anuradha Roy. I love this a lot, and I'm really sad that it didn't make the shortlist, because this is, I think, my favourite of the long list so far. I think I like this more than Washington Black and The Western Wind, which I do love very much as well. This follows a man called Mishkin, who is looking back on his childhood in India in the 1930s. I'm going to read you the first paragraph actually, because I feel like that gives you a really good introduction, and this is one of those books when I read the first paragraph and I was like, oh yes, I'm going to like this one. In my childhood, I was known as the boy whose mother had run off with an Englishman. The man was in fact German, but in small-town India in those days, all white foreigners were largely thought of as British. This unconcern for accuracy annoyed my scholarly father, even in circumstances as dire as losing his wife to another man. So this follows Mishkin sort of before and after his mother leaves their family, and it looks at him in his childhood, how that affected him, his relationship with his mother and his father in 1937 and in the run-up to the Second World War, looking at the effects of the Second World War on small-town India, but also kind of the effects of the growing independence movement in India. And then it also looks at Mishkin as an older man, sort of in his 60s, looking back on his life and kind of rediscovering more about his mother and learning to kind of reinterpret the reasons why she left and their relationship. I just loved this so much. I thought it was fantastic. It probably, like, one of the really interesting things I find with reading historical fiction is there are certain books that I'm going to enjoy slightly more anyway because of the period or the place that they're set in. I find the history of India, especially in 19th and early 20th century India, really interesting. So this was kind of like, I was biased towards this to begin with, but it is fantastic and it so interestingly explores so many themes. I thought the way it looks at Mishkin's relationship with his mother was wonderful, and his mother is such an interesting character, a real kind of fiercely independent woman who marries too young and ends up with a life that she did not want, wishing to have had a different life. And the way, like, the title of the book, All the Lives We Never Lived, like, there's so much in this book about kind of different possibilities or turning moments in lives when your life could have gone one way or another. And also the way this book looks at the Second World War's effect on particular places in Asia, both India and Bali, were so interesting. And the way this book looks at family and identity and culture and independence and different ways of being forward-thinking are really interesting, especially sort of in the relationship between Mishkin's parents. His mother is kind of, you know, very feminist in many ways and wants independence as a woman. His father is obsessed with independence for India and kind of escaping British rule, but he also rules over his wife quite firmly at times. Mishkin's mother is a painter, and that element of the book I found really lovely and interestingly explored as well. It's also a looking back narrative, which is something I always love, although I say that After the Party was a looking back narrative and it didn't work so well for me there, but this was a really good looking back narrative in which the character reassessed things about that younger time and kind of came to new conclusions in the course of going through this process of memory, I suppose, which is what I like in a looking back narrative. And it was just so moving and so powerful and so lovely. And as I said, the look at Mishkin reevaluating his relationship with his mother, who was absent for a lot of his childhood, is wonderful. And when I compare this to Warlight, which is similarly about a man looking back on his life and reevaluating his relationship with his mother, who was absent for most of his childhood, this does this so much better. Reading this like really brought home to me how ineffectual for me Warlight was, because it just didn't move me in the way that this did, and it didn't explore that relationship in the way that this did, and this was fantastic, and I'm so sad that this is not on the shortlist because this is amazing. So I would really, really highly recommend All the Lies We Never Lived, and I will definitely be reading more by Anuradha Roy in the future. So, to talk about the shortlist for the Walter Scott Prize. There are 6 books on the shortlist. There is The Western Wind by Samantha Harvey, Now We Shall Be Entirely Free by Andrew Miller, The Long Take by Robin Robertson, After the Party by Cressida Connolly, Warlight by Michael Ondate, and A Long Way From Home by Peter Carey. So I have read 4 out of 6 of the long list, so I haven't yet read Now We Shall Be Entirely Free, and I haven't yet read A Long Way From Home by Peter Carey, both of which I think I will read before the winner is announced in the beginning of June. I am more interested in reading Now We Shall Be Entirely Free than I am A Long Way From Home, just because Now We Shall Be Entirely Free is set in the 19th century and A Long Way From Home is set in the 50s, and I'm more of a 19th century person than a 50s person myself. In terms of my preferences from the shortlist so far, having read 4 of them, I would be sad if Warlight or After the Party won, because both of them for me, I liked the writing but I didn't like the book, if you see what I mean. And both of them fell a little flat for me and I didn't get either of them, I suppose, in a way. Neither of them were really for me. But I would be very happy if The Western Wind by Samantha Harvey won. I love Samantha Harvey a lot as an author, and I think this is a fantastic book. And I think I would also be quite happy if The Long Take won. And in a way, like, I think I love The Western Wind more, but this is such an interesting and different novel, and maybe that's just because I don't read novels in verse. Maybe I wouldn't think it was so original if I was someone who read novels in verse, because I know there are other novels in verse in the world, but I thought this was fantastic too. So either of these I'd be happy. Warlight and After the Party I'd be less happy. And then yeah, I need to read the other 2. But as I said, there are also still a few books from the long list that I would like to read. So in terms of my Walter Scott Prize reading going forwards, the people at the Walter Scott Prize very kindly sent me 3 review copies of books that I was really having trouble getting hold of. I was trying to get as many of these books out of the library as possible, and there were 3 that just my London borough didn't have in their libraries, which they very kindly sent me review copies of. So I have Now We Shall Be Entirely Free by Andrew Miller. I'm really excited about this one. It's set, I believe, in early 19th century Britain, which is a period in history I enjoy. It's quite long, but actually I say that, the text is quite big, so maybe it's not as long as I thought it was. This should be quite interesting. And as I said, of course, one of my priorities as it made the shortlist. We then have Little by Edward Carey. It's about a waxwork maker and is set, I believe, in revolutionary France, so this should be quite interesting. And then I also have Dark Water by Elizabeth Lowry. This sounds really, really interesting and has kind of gone up in my interest level since I first heard about it. It is set in the 19th century. Some of it is set on a ship, but apparently not very much of it is set on a ship, which reassures me because I'm not always that big a fan of novels on ships. So hopefully I'll get to all of these 3 at some point. Like I said, I think Now We Should Be Entirely Free will be my priority, but then I will try and get to these 2 as well, because even if they haven't made the shortlist, as we've discovered so far, my favourite novel from the long list was All the Lies We Never Lived, which didn't make the shortlist, so I might love both of these a lot as well. And I think those 3 plus A Long Way From Home, which I'm hoping to get from the library, brings me up to 10 out of 12 of the long list, and the other 2 on the long list are ones that are part of series, so I wasn't intending to read them anyway. So that will be 10 out of 12 from the long list, which would be quite a lot. So I have 6 weeks. I think I can read 4 books in 6 weeks, considering I read the 3 books that I talked about today in all of 6 days. I'm really enjoying reading along with the long list. I'm discovering some interesting new books and some interesting new authors. So please let me know down in the comments if you've read any of the books I spoke about today and what you thought of them, and if there's any of those 4 remaining ones from the long list that I'm going to be reading that you have read and you would like to especially recommend me. I'm really enjoying doing this project so far, and I hope you've been enjoying watching the videos. And yeah, I think that's all for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.